Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last EVN Disrupt podcast of 2022. Our guest this week is Raffi Kassarjian. Raffi is the former CEO and current advisor to the CEO of UATE, the Union of Advanced Technology Enterprises. He's also the CEO of Sensyan and a board member here at EVN Report. Together, we reviewed the past year and spoke about the major events that took place, including the state of the tech market globally and where Armenia fits into that context, the influx of Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian talent to Armenia, the arrival of more global tech companies to the country, and the impact that the appreciation of the dram has had on the sector. Thank you for listening, and I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season. Raffi, thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you, Nirjay. It's great to be back.
We're at the end of 2022. We're getting ready to wrap up the year. So I thought it'd be good to have you on to talk about the major events of the year and sort of look towards 2023 and see what we can expect. So I think we have to start by talking about the state of tech globally. It was a very different year compared to 2021 and 2020, when we saw a huge boom in startup investing and tech companies growing very, very rapidly. This year, there was a bit of a slowdown. Talk to us a little bit about the context of Armenia in the current global tech scene.
Sure, you're right. I would say, a bit of a slowdown is probably an understatement. If we look at the major indices, the Nasdaq is down by close to 30%. That's the stock market that's most closely tied. That has the most sort of largest number of tech companies incorporated into the index. More importantly, venture capital, which saw a huge boom year in 2021, where the expectations that there'll be about 30 to 35% less venture investment in 2022 than 2021. And as you know, that's kind of the primary driver of startup activity, new startup activity. In addition, since the markets are expecting continued slowdown generally, and companies are being more careful, especially in the B2B sector, so venture capitalists with existing investments and, for example, B2B SaaS or other companies are encouraging their portfolio companies to be much more careful heading into 2023, a little more focus on, expense control. And although growth is also important, they're just saying be a little bit more careful. So all of that is leading to kind of a more careful approach to market, both among existing companies and new companies to be funded. That's globally. In some ways, that has impacted Armenia as well. The other thing I would mention is that there are sort of these technology trends that we need to that are under review, right? So in 2020 and 21, we saw COVID and post-COVID boom in anything digital as people were interacting more online for a variety of services. That's begun to pull back in 2022 as people are kind of sort of, the worst part of the pandemic's over. Secondly, there are these kind of mega trends. We saw what happened with crypto starting in November with FTX. And that's also in some ways impacting the blockchain market. And then, Facebook and others' huge investment or let's say belief in the growth of the metaverse is somehow kind of hasn't proven itself out yet. So we've got both from a technology perspective and a markets or economy perspective, we've got kind of these downward forces impacting the global technology market.
Before we dive into those details, I'm curious to understand, the 2021 tech boom, would you accredit it largely to behavior changes, like people moving towards doing things more digitally online, or was a lot of it based on government policy around COVID and things of that nature?
Well, I think it's both. I think government policy mandating isolation or separation drove a lot of companies to look for creative ways to be able to continue business doing it online. One very interesting example, for example, is field service. So when you have a problem with a machine or something at home, you will call the company, and that usually the first thing they do is send somebody out. Well, because they couldn't expose, imagine somebody that's going to several homes or businesses to try to fix solutions. That's a huge potential carrier issue. So companies had to move more into remote field service management, which incorporated using newer technologies to access devices remotely. So I think it was sort of government policy ended up driving technological innovation.
Right. As a necessity.
Yes, exactly.
In terms of access to venture capital funding, as you said, we saw a huge slowdown in 2022. However, there's also a lot of reports that venture capitalists are sitting on a lot of what is known as dry powder. So they have the funds, but they're not allocating them because they're sort of waiting back to see what the market will look like in 2023. What do you think will be the sort of catalyst to see greater VC funding again?
obviously, dry powder is good in the sense that you have sort of, you're not sort of fund starved to be able to drive your portfolio. On the flip side, it can't sit there forever, right? I mean, there's a lot better ways for use of that money, especially, I mean, with interest rates so high. I mean, it's it could even be better for somebody to pull money out of a fund and put it into sort of safer investments. But having said that, I think the venture industry is very good at spotting promising trends, right? And so I think, for example, I think B2B SaaS is an area, especially verticalized SaaS for specific industries where things haven't been as digitized or have been inefficient. I think they'll continue to drive investment. I think AI has proven itself as a technology that's here to stay for the long term and is now being applied in many more ways. And so companies that are fueling, and not just AI directly in terms of developing the models, but infrastructure investments in things like faster databases or more energy efficient processing. All of these things are things that will continue to attract investment. So again, I don't want to sort of paint a very dire picture. I think we have had a correction, but I think a correction is also healthy because, when you're in these boom cycles, there's so much money flowing into it that the investment criteria tend to become a little bit loose, and now we're heading into, I think, tighter investment criteria, which in the long term is good.
Yeah, especially in the context of AI. I think a lot of AI that we see capture headlines are really just research projects that stay in academia or in large labs and industry. We've yet to see them really come to the market and turn into products that we use. So I think the growth of that will continue over the next 5 to 10 years. And what you mentioned with sort of infrastructure for AI, sort of the MLOps space, things like faster databases and annotation software and things of that nature, it's really exciting that we have at least 4 Armenian startups that are solving some really big problems in that space. Super Annotate, Active Loop, Monot, and Unum, yeah, that's right. Yeah, so that's really exciting that we have a healthy growing MLOps ecosystem.
And it goes beyond that. I mean, there's also, so they're sort of focused on the actual sort of database processing aspect of it. But there are companies like RBlocks that are really focused on having sort of more energy efficient transmission at the network layer. Mm-hmm. So that's another way that actually that's another technology that can help the development and spreading of AI technologies.
Yeah, absolutely. I should mention AimStack in there as well in the MLOps space. One of the major sort of events of the year in terms of the Armenian tech sector was an influx of Russian engineering talent to Armenia after the invasion of Ukraine in February of this year. We saw with it tens of thousands of Russians coming to the country, and that also included the opening of several new offices, I should say, in Armenia. Some of the most prominent ones would be Miro, and I believe Yandex also significantly expanded their operations here. What do you think about this for the long term? Do you think that talent is likely here to stay, or is it still something that's temporary and it's sort of in a transitionary period?
Well, I think it's tough to say, Najde, frankly, because, you sort of, have to put yourself into the mindset of an average, Russian software engineer or the people in management that are running this, right? I mean, I think obviously in the long term, if people have forcibly moved from somewhere, they'd at some point like to come back.
Yeah.
At the same time, I think if you just compare just the quality of life here versus Moscow or other cities in Russia, even outside of the context of the political context, I mean, for a lot of people, I think it's been interesting. I think Armenia's been a pretty welcoming community and society to Russians coming here.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that we thought, one problem that we thought this would help solve, which hasn't materialized yet, is that, as you know, and we've talked about this before, there's this huge imbalance between the supply of qualified engineers in Armenia and the demand. The demand's always been much greater. Yeah. And we thought that this large influx of Russian software engineers, especially people that are working already for Western companies, either directly or as freelancers, would kind of help to
mitigate that,
feed into the pool of available talent. That mostly hasn't happened because they're coming with sort of valuable contracts, and because cost of living is significantly less in Armenia than in Russia, they're sort of, they're living very well, and there's no real incentive to try to move. Now, over the long term, I think that'll change because labor markets in tech are actually very, very sort of fluid and open and mobile. So I would expect that as Armenian companies become better in terms of attracting this talent, and also Russians and others, Ukrainians, Belarusians, becoming more comfortable living here and seeing, being here for the longer term, I think we'll see a more positive impact in 2023 and beyond.
As in, you think Armenia Armenian companies will be able to attract them to work.
Yes, and they already have to some extent. That's already happened. It hasn't happened at the level or scale that we'd like, but I think that I would expect that will continue. Yeah.
One really big positive that I took away from this is that although maybe there wasn't an influx of, let's say, senior software engineers into Armenian companies from Russia, I know several startups that have been able to hire at sort of like the engineering manager or VP of engineering level, some really like high quality talent that they weren't necessarily able to find in Armenia before. And that might be a catalyst for growth for those specific companies. And in the Armenian context, if 5 or 6 of those companies really are able to scale and become successful thanks to those key hirings, that's a big deal for our ecosystem, I would say.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Raffi, one of the other big events of the year was the appreciation of the dram against the dollar. I think there was an article out yesterday that said it was the highest appreciating currency in 2022. And this has had a big impact on the tech sector because the tech sector works primarily in dollars. Their customers are global, and the investments they attract are also in US dollars. Speak a little bit about the impact this has had on companies here.
Yes, a great question. So it's had a significant impact on both traditional outsourcing companies whose entire sort of financial model is based on the attractiveness of their rates, sort of the cost quality of what they deliver through their services versus other, much larger, competing economies such as India or Philippines or wherever. So all of a sudden, because of the appreciation of the dram, their costs have increased. You can either say that their costs have increased or their revenues have decreased by 25% because they earn in dollars and they have to spend in drams. Right. On the other hand, for product companies, especially venture-funded companies, but not only, again, you've got the same issue where their revenue is in dollars and the cost continue. And by the way, it's not just an appreciation of the dram against the dollar, but we've also had some inflation here as well. So expenses have gone up and revenue's gone significantly down. I think that could have a serious impact in 2023. Now, the government's taken some steps to alleviate that, but they did that for sort of a temporary 4-month period and see how things go. But it will mean that the more difficult it is for outsourcing companies to succeed, the less sort of engineers can come through that pipeline that could be potential future startup founders. And then for the product companies, their runways are much shorter. So, let's say a $300,000 or $500,000 or $1 million investment means that you've got essentially 20-25% less runway in terms of expense until you become cash flow positive. So I think that's a trend that we need to look at very closely in 2023, and hopefully there'll be some stabilization of the currency and some reappreciation of the dollar to sort of bring that back.
It also comes at a particularly challenging time for the ecosystem because you said 12 to 18 months, let's say, to become cash flow positive. A lot of startups rely on that 12 to 18 months to just raise their next round. And now that they have a huge challenge in raising their subsequent round, especially for growth stage startups that are sort of at the Series B level, where it's harder to get financing now, they don't have that means to get their next round of financing.
Absolutely. We're actually seeing some startups now who would plan to go to a Series A or to the next round, kind of doing bridge financing through, convertible notes or smaller rounds to try to sort of ride the wave, and hopefully until the market turns around.
Right. The other really big news from earlier this year was that NVIDIA opened up their office this year. It's, I would say, the first really sort of big tech presence in the country. What effect do you think this can have down the road for having a company of NVIDIA's caliber here?
Well, of course, as you mentioned, I think NVIDIA has been one of the stars, right? Especially in the context of AI and their GPUs. So it's a big name. I think that it will. We've had other big names in the past, but they've been less, I would say, sort of known industry-wide. We've talked before about electronic design automation, Synopsys, Mentor Graphics, which turns into Siemens, Virage Logic. And so NVIDIA is kind of in some ways it's the extension of sort of that tradition in Armenia. But on the other hand, as you mentioned, it's a big name. And it will, especially in the context of what's happened with the Russian invasion, Armenia's own, sort of geopolitical stance, having, a major company making an investment like that can only be seen as a positive thing.
Yeah. I should mention that it was noted that this was in the works for a while. It wasn't a direct result necessarily of the events in Ukraine, although I imagine that probably sped up the process a little bit. In terms of sort of the first big name coming, if we consider NVIDIA sort of the first name of that caliber to open up a presence in Armenia. Do you think it might have a domino effect for other FANG level companies like the Facebooks and Googles of the world to open up a presence here?
Well, I do know that some companies, like Google in particular, are taking a broader interest. AWS is also taking a broader. I'm just seeing more people from those companies sort of visiting Armenia more often. I think the other thing we can't ignore is that there were a number of companies that took interest in Armenia as a result of WCIT in 2019, which was kind of the first major global tech event that happened in Armenia. Last year, we had Digitech Summit, which was also for the first time, we had a summit in addition to the expo. Mm-hmm. And the summit was really meant as an international conference that happens to take place in Armenia, as opposed to a conference about Armenian tech. And we're unfortunately, because of what happened in September, we had to delay the Digitech for this year. It's going to happen in March of 2023 and then again in October. And we hope that, and we're really positioning the summit as a way for these, representatives of larger companies to come and see what's going on in the Armenian tech scene. And I think NVIDIA is a great kind of, reference for us to use to try to draw more folks here.
When you're interacting with people from companies of that caliber, what are the primary things they're looking for before opening up a presence in the country?
So it's a combination of things. I mean, obviously, it's no secret that Armenia is a small market in and of itself. So in terms of making an investment to try to sort of drive a lot of revenue from a small market like Armenia is really not a factor to consider. On the other hand, I think tech is kind of like a lot of other industries where when somebody discovers sort of a hidden talent or an opportunity that hasn't been seized before, the other ones start looking into it. Obviously, number one has to be the level of talent and the ability and creative talent. So it's not just we certainly can't do it in terms of numbers, so we have to do it in terms of quality, and innovation, and people that can think from a product perspective, not just purely from a technology perspective. But there are other things like, how is government policy towards companies making investments in Armenia? What is the continued investment in education, which has been a sore subject for many, many years? But I also think, and this is actually the subject for Digitech this year, I think one of the interesting things we have, if you look at what's going on globally, right, and you've seen the geopolitical tensions and also pressures on smaller countries by larger countries, there's this kind of, is there a connection between sort of countries that are more democratic and have more open societies, and what is that relation to the growth of the tech industry? So I mean, Ukraine had a very healthy tech industry, as you know. They've had to shift a lot of it, but also continue some of it. We think about Taiwan, we think about Singapore, Ireland, Israel, right? So these are all smaller countries that are batting above their weight when it comes to tech, and a lot of it has tied to the openness of the society. And if you think about Armenian society, even before the Velvet Revolution, tech was the most independent of sectors, and we're seeing and we'll continue to see that growth. And that's going to be it'll be interesting to see how the panel discussions around this pan out, but we've had a lot of interest from those countries to participate as a result.
Can you tell us the dates of the upcoming Digitech?
Yes, so Digitech 22, which has been postponed, will take place March 10th to 12th of this year, again at the Garin Demirjian Sports Complex, and then we will revert back to our regular annual cycle in October.
In the fall, October,
yes.
Right. Shifting back to venture capital for a minute, one of the things that I also thought was very noteworthy this year was that early stage startups, sort of at the pre-seed and seed stage level, were still able to raise funds, especially from local Armenian venture capital firms. We had two new VC firms that began their investments this year. One of them was Big Story VC, and the other one was Formula VC. I think combined, they've probably invested in more than 15 startups at this point, sort of at the $250,000 level, although the total rounds of those pre-seed and seed rounds were greater. I think it's really healthy that for a small and growing ecosystem, so much is relative, I would say, but we have access to early stage funding, and we saw several early stage startups sort of be able to get off the ground thanks to that. How do you look at the VC landscape in Armenia? And I know you've been a part of it for many years now. How do you see the growth over the last few years, and what's to be expected for the future?
Well, certainly. I mean, if we look at today versus even 7 or 8 years ago, I mean, it's completely different. Yeah. And I think it's a combination of two things, Nijde. I think one is that Armenian startups or startups led by Armenian founders have attracted more sort of, tier 1, tier 2 venture capital, and that's actually turned more of an eye on Armenia. So now we're seeing that when you have a local venture capital firm, some outside firms are more likely to consider it. So they're riding along on the investments, which I think is great. The second thing is that we have, Big Story is a great example of what I call kind of like a second generation effect.
Yeah.
So that, the founders or the general partners of Big Story are all, founders of successful startups. And so they're now taking their learning and applying it on a broader level. And that also is a testament to the growth of the startup ecosystem here. Mm-hmm. And so I expect that to continue. I think with not Big Story, the other one was
Formula VC.
Yeah, Formula VC. That's also a great combination of people that have experience in startups, bringing in somebody like SAP with a startup factory and sort of creating another angle to it. And I expect that to continue as well. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, as retail investors become more comfortable making angel investments, and then after angel investments, sort of investing in funds, you'll see more, I think, Armenian private money flowing into these venture firms, and that can only be good for the economy, for the ecosystem.
It's interesting the catalyst effects we see in startup ecosystem generally when some startup reaches sort of the growth stage where they're at their Series B level, or if they have a successful exit. There's an influx of cash and capital into that ecosystem. A lot of those employees will go on to start their own startups because their equity has matured, or they become angel investors or VCs themselves. And as we see the sort of first wave of big Armenian startup exits over the next however many years, I think that's expected to grow. Do you think we'll see Armenian venture capital firms investing in later stages as well down the road, or for the foreseeable future, will we have them at the seed and pre-seed stage as we do now?
Well, I think it's dependent on a number of things. I think, first of all, it's just a matter of how much money they can attract in the funds, right? Because to invest in later stages, you're talking about sort of larger tickets.
Yeah.
So you've just got to be able to bring in more money into each transaction that you're involved in. And frankly, I'm not sure that's necessary, Nishde. I think VCs that are here are closer to newer startups. I think we saw that there was, we kind of solved the seed investment issue here, but there's this gap between seed and a larger Series A or Series B that I think company or funds such as Big Story and others can help to fill. But, why not take advantage of the large amount of money? In 2021, there was over $300 billion of venture, sort of investment around the world to feed the later rounds, and it has a multiplicative effect. It's not just cash, but it's also the networks that those VCs have, introductions they can make to customers, introductions they can make to other portfolio companies so they can partner. So I think I'm not sure that we really need to sort of create a whole new thing that already exists globally. And frankly, you want to, the fact that you can attract a Series A or Series B from a tier 1, tier 2 firm, not just from Silicon Valley, but around the world, means that your product and your company's value proposition is such that it's a global value proposition as opposed to just an Armenian one.
Yeah. And we've seen that the successful startups in Armenia have had no challenges attracting capital in their Series A and Series B rounds from top firms around the world. Okay, Raffi, just turning towards our last question now. Looking towards 2023, what hopes do you have for the ecosystem? What should we be looking out for?
Well, I hope that the move towards productization and Armenian entrepreneurs, especially sort of people that have worked in larger, more established companies, their risk appetite will continue, and their ability to deliver on product market fit will mean more successful early stage startups coming into play in 2023. I think the next big sort of how can I put it, capabilities investment needs to be in not how well they sort of understand product market fit, and not as much how they can attract investment, but how they can position themselves to be able to negotiate complex deals with large partners or land large clients. So I think that's the last kind of set of capabilities that you really need as a startup, which is, you've got the engineer, you've got the idea right, you've thought about, you've done your market research, you know where the white space is, and you know how to sort of you continue to iterate on your product market fit until you get there. But then at some point you need to be able to sit across a table from a very large B2B customer or a technology partner that's much larger than you, that's critical to your path to market, and be able to sort of, have an engaging and ultimately fruitful negotiation with them. So I think if we can solve that issue, I will continue to see a lot more growth. And as I mentioned earlier, hopefully some of this wave of Russian engineers and Ukrainian and Belarusian engineers will be here to stay, and will also feed into the sort of the capacity imbalance that we have.
Integrate with local companies.
Yes.
Yeah. Raffi Jan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Great, Nish. It's always a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.